All right. How you doing?
I'm doing okay. How are you?
I'm doing great. All right. Well, let me do the little spiely things off the top here. So, welcome to Make Your Own Fun. I'm here with Chelsey Clammer, and I had to write this down so I could remember everything because you've done so much. So,
Awesome.
she is the author of Body Home from Hopewell Publications, a dog.
A dog. She freaks out when she hears me talking. She's like, "Who are you talking to?"
There's no one here. What the
I
hell?
know. She'll calm down in a second. She'll get used to it.
Circadian from Red Hen Press, and also I guess it's forthcoming from Red Hen Press. The title is Human Heartbeat Detected. Is that right?
Yep, it's coming out at the end of August.
Woo! All right,
Yeah.
nice. Oh, well, first of all, thank you so much for being on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Nice. It's so great to finally meet you and talk to you. So I guess we'll start with the writing stuff first.
Okay.
So I guess maybe tell me about some early influences and like when you were younger, did somebody maybe like gift you a book or you stumbled across something and you were like, I want to do that.
I have this piece of paper from when I was in elementary school that says, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" And I have writer on there. I don't remember writing this whatsoever.
Oh my God, no one knows. Everyone who puts like astronaut or something.
I know exactly right. Well, I actually went to college and did pre-med because I thought everybody became a doctor. That's just what you do. And then I quit pre-med and did English and feminist studies. So I thought you had to be a doctor, but you don't. You can be a writer.
No,
You know, so if you see me tugging, I have a toy. It's to keep my dog placated. She keeps like tugging on me. So
no
if you
worries.
see me doing this, that's why. I think when I was younger, I don't remember the names of the books, but there was like this guy who wrote some fiction novels about like a Native American going somewhere, I don't know. And we had to read it and then write a new ending for it. And so I remember having to write that ending, and I won whatever contest they had and got like a signed copy of the book. So I remember feeling pretty cool about that. And my elementary school always had us make little books every year, and they laminated them and put them in spiral
Wow,
form.
that's cool. A lot of schools
Yeah.
don't do that. So
Yeah, so I have all of those too, somewhere in the millions of boxes I have. But that was that influence. And then as I grew up, like in high school, I really liked Emily Dickinson, and I wanted to be that dark, mysterious kind of poet type person. So I wore a lot of black and I read a lot of poetry. And then eventually, I think maybe like around after college, I started really getting into personal essays. And I read the memoir Madness by Maria Hornbacher, and I just absolutely loved it. And then a few years after that, she ended up teaching in Chicago, even though she lives in Minneapolis, and I was living in Chicago. And I was like, oh my God, I have to take a class with Maria Hornbacher. Even though I wasn't in school, I was already done with school. I never even attended the school she was teaching at. And she decided, I emailed her, and she said that we could do an independent study. And so I ended up meeting with her for coffee every morning at like 6 a.m. because that was the only time that our schedules linked up.
Yeah.
I know. And so we ended up, she like critiqued my writing for me. And then she ended up just becoming a really good friend of mine. And I actually ended up living with her. And through that, I kind of like saw what a writer got to do in life and like what that meant to be a writer. And then from then on, I just started writing my heart out and started making books.
Nice. I gotta ask you about the Emily Dickinson stuff because I've read some of her stuff too, but how much of a badass do you have to be that you can like end a poem with a dash?
Right.
Like I've tried, I mean, I write too, and I try to do that, and it's so forced and lame, and I'm like, how did you like, because not many people can get away with that. So I mean, if you ever read that and go like, well, I'm gonna try,
No, it's not happening. It's the same thing. Oh my God. And if my friend Lorraine Herring, if you watch this, she's going to love this. I hate the ellipses, which is kind of the same thing as a dash, although I use dashes all the time. But an ellipses, you only are supposed to use if you're like taking out a block of quote from like, or you're quoting somebody and you're taking out some text, or if you are like trailing off in dialogue. Right, but a lot of people use the ellipses as the like suspense or what happens next type thing. And that's not how you use it. And so ending on an ellipses always just bugs me to no end. And as an editor, I'm always like, no to the ellipses. So ending on an M dash though, I do find that interesting because I've done that, well, not on like an end sentence or anything on it, but I use dashes a lot in my writing because it's kind of like an extended pause. So you do have to be a badass to be able to end on it. That's for sure.
Like I said, I've tried it and it's just like, oh, it's weak sauce. But you know, it's funny. Like I've started with like an ellipsis, like the dot 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 leading into something, and that just seems a little bit stronger. And then you know, ending with an ellipsis, I'm like, it's so wishy washy. But
Yeah.
have you started with like an ellipsis, like
I never
leading
have.
in like a dream, or like you're thinking of something, and then it's like something drifting in, almost like people watching, where it's like you hear like part of a sentence and then it comes in. But so the Emily
That's
Dickinson thing is
interesting.
awesome. So let me ask you this: was there maybe like a turning point or a jumping off point, maybe of where you weren't really exposed to like a certain writer or certain group of writers, and someone kind of like pulled you in and said like, hey, Chelsey, you've got to check this out. And you're like, well, what is this? I didn't see this at the library. And like, no, it's like somebody local. And they, you know, people do open mics and this and that. And you're like, what? So I don't know if you were like maybe a teenager, maybe somebody kind of pulled you into that a little bit.
I don't think when I was a teen at all. I remember when I was living in Chicago in my 20s, I worked at the feminist bookstore Women and Children First, and I was like wanting to be a writer, but didn't quite know how to do that really. I just like journaled a lot and I didn't know what else to do. And one of my coworkers, her name's Kathy Bergquist, and she started doing like a salon series inside of her house, and people would just come and they'd read something. And she'd give like funny prizes at the end of it, like paintings or whatever she had around the house. And so that really introduced me to like presenting my work to other people, and starting to look at writing not as just like a journaling act, but something that like I could work on and have a craft and actually like present it to people. And then again, like when I lived with and studied with Maria, she opened me up to a lot of lyric essayists, which is what I really loved writing. It's kind of like a mixture of weird format and poetry, but using it as a personal essay. And so I had like no idea that that was even a genre. And the way that my brain thinks, it's not like a linear sort of progression. I jump around all over the place. And so the lyric essay form really felt like it spoke to me in a way. And so I started reading lyric essays, and that's when my mind just like flew open. And that was probably in my late 20s, I would say.
Okay. Well, I'll piggyback on what you were saying about Chicago and just say, have you noticed like a shift or a nice kind of shot in the arm with your writing whenever you've moved to like a different state or a different city, and you're just influenced by all the other writers or just the city like itself? I know I think you said you're in Texas now, so.
Yeah, I've moved so many times in my life. I think I counted it once since like 20 something times, and I'm 39. And all of that has happened in like the past 10 or 15 years. So I've constantly moved around. And actually most influential, this last time I moved, I lived in Colorado for a year, and it was out in the middle of nowhere. I mean, like the neighbors were, you measured it as the crow flies type thing. So it was like way out there. Can you hear her squeaking in the background?
Yeah, but people are just gonna think I put some kind of like crazy sound effect on here. They're like, and their conversation got so boring. It was just.
She's laying on her back with her squeaky toy. She's doing this like a bottle. Give me that damn toy.
Well, I mean, if she's feeling it, it's all good.
She's feeling it. I should get a toy that doesn't have a squeaker. That would be helpful.
And the dog would just be like.
She's like, what? That's not making noise. What is this?
Like, I'm over it.
Yeah. Anyways, so I lived in, it was called Cripple Creek, Colorado, and it was out in the middle of nowhere. And I mean, like you could see the mountains in New Mexico. That's how far out it was. Like, yeah, it was very much so out in the middle of nowhere. And the first time I lived out there, it was 2012. And I started trying to write about nature because I'm like, I'm surrounded by nature. I should write about it. It didn't happen. I didn't turn into a nature writer. But then the second time that I lived out there this past year, I started to get a lot more like quiet sort of essays, more like meditative and reflexive type thing compared to like when I was living in Chicago and there's so many writers and there's a lot to do. I wrote a lot more about like interactions with people and like fun sorts of stories of that way. So I definitely know like my surroundings influence me. And then it also depends too, a lot of it with scheduling and time, because when I was in Colorado, I was living by myself. And so I could write and knit. I also knit all the time. And so I wrote and knit all the time. And now I'm living in Texas at my sister's house, and there's 6 people in this house. And so it's harder, it's harder to find that time to write. But I realize like I'm constantly writing in my head throughout the day. And then whenever I do have the time to just sit down, I have much more of like a rush of words. And a lot of it is about family relations, because here I am surrounded by family.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I was just gonna ask that too. If you did have a lot of like your roommate situations, if you find yourself taking like a notebook to like a cafe or a restaurant or a park and just sitting there and like having quiet time, because some people really do need like that white noise of like being in a crazy busy diner and there's just people coming and going, you know.
Yeah, and it's interesting because my habits have changed depending on where I've lived. When I lived in Minneapolis and I was living with Maria, we went to a coffee shop and just wrote all day. And that's just, we like camped out, we were outside, we were like chain smoking cigarettes and writing. That's what we did. And then as I've lived in different spaces, I've definitely gone to like public parks as a place to write. Mostly because I was a smoker, and I actually quit smoking yesterday. So I'm like, okay, here we go.
Nice.
So I'm a little jittery, that's why. No,
Are you just like totally backing that up with coffee now, or?
I know, exactly. That's, yeah, I'm drinking a lot of coffee basically the past 24 hours. But so I would always write outside, and I just got used to writing outside. Yes. Wait, what does that say? Writer fuel. I love it. My sister got me the coffee mug that says I'm silently correcting your grammar, which is sometimes true. When I watch TV and news shows, I do it all the time. But so I wrote in public parks a lot. And now that I'm in this house, I have a balcony that's like my little writing area.
Oh, I think I saw that on one of your YouTube videos. It was like the Patreon one.
Yeah. Oh, that was a different balcony. But yeah, so I've always had a balcony as well. It's been like my office has always been outside, because when I've lived in Texas, you can do that. You can have an outside office year round. So now I have this balcony here, and I have found that now my writing, I have to be in a quiet space, because I got used to being in quiet spaces compared to the coffee shops. So now, yes, I have to have like that nobody around me quiet space to really focus what I'm saying.
No, that makes sense. So I know you do a lot of essay writing now. Do you find that for the essays, you could do more personal essays and that's easier and that's something you gravitate toward? Or maybe it's something like you can still do like the quote unquote, like people watching, present yourself as a character in a story. Because one thing I tell people when it comes to like me writing poetry, there's the personal stuff, but there's also, you experience things out in the world, we hear bits of conversation. And I also say, I, like the letter I in a poem or something I'm writing, it doesn't always mean me.
Oh, interesting. I say interesting because like I've tried writing fiction and I just can't do it. It turns into like third person perspective, but then it turns into memoir in the third person. So I've tried doing it, and the fiction that I have written and published has been really weird, almost like speculative fiction. And I've had to do that to keep it like separate from my life. Because all of my writing, I've always focused on me as the main like source of information and the main thing that I'm witnessing. And so a lot of my writing has been about my family and my dad, who died in 2004. So it's been a while, so I've been able to write about him. And a lot about family and a lot about relationships and gender and sexuality. And a lot about trauma and healing from that. And so I've just always used like my life as the inspiration of what I write about. And I don't know, actually I do know. I think it's because I journaled a lot as a kid, and I just always was like into detailing my life. So I'm just kind of focused into that. And lately though, I'm working on a collection of essays about the empowering women in my life. And so I've done more of like looking at other people's lives and commenting on them, and it's still having like my relationship with them in it. But I just finished an essay that's about like my mom and dad's relationship that I'm not really in the essay, I'm more of reporting on it. So that's kind of like a new thing that I'm starting to do. It's a shift, but it's fun.
Well, yeah, I mean, just to kind of add on to that, so I'm getting the sense that the essays are more personal and maybe like from what you were talking about, some of those topics, like maybe therapeutic.
Yeah, definitely.
I mean, are there other things that you do for writing? I don't want to say like fucking off, but just like fun. You know what I mean? Like there's
Yeah.
like that, it's like stuff we write to like process or work through. Then there's other stuff where we're just like, I want to have fun and just screw off and write something
Yes.
goofy and silly because it's like that's part of our lives and our personality too, is to have fun, you know.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. And I love that too. Like one of my friends commented, she was like, you always write such dark, like traumatic material. And I'm like, that's what gets published. But the stuff that I write, I'm not constantly writing about dark, traumatic stuff. Like I write stuff to entertain myself because if you're not going to have fun when you're writing, what is the point?
I mean, that's
You
a
know?
long time to sit in a chair and
Yes.
be focused and like get through like drudgery. And it's like your friend makes it, I mean, I'm just like adding on to what she was saying, but it almost makes it sound like she's picturing you like
Yeah.
sitting in a dark room with like a naked light bulb hanging down, and it's
It's
like
like everything
raining
sucks.
and
This is
it's
my life.
dark, and you're like
Yeah.
with a cigarette and a blanket trying to like, and you're just like, fuck all of you, die horrible. And then,
Yeah, that's absolutely my life. No lie.
but I mean, you know, it's like, yeah, exactly. You gotta have fun. And
Yeah.
like I always tell people too that especially if they are doing something where they're processing or it's therapeutic and they're trying to get through it, it's like the earth has been around for a while. No matter what
Yeah.
happens, there will be more sunny days.
Yes. Yeah.
So I mean, so what kind of like the I'm just curious now, like what kind of goofy or funny stuff do you kind of like
What do I
use or just, you know, eke out, I guess?
I actually will go for more of like fun writing. She wants her toy so bad. I hate her.
You can give it to her. Fine.
I did, but it's the squeaking anyway. So I go actually more for just awkward and fun wording. And so I'll talk about random things. Like I just had this essay published. I don't know if I shared it with people, but it was called Period. And it was about having PMS and being like angry and not wanting to be angry because that's such a stereotype of somebody who's going through PMS. And so I went on this whole thing and I went on a rant about ellipses in it. I mean, just this whole like rant piece that was just fun for me to write because I felt frustrated. And I just try to use like really funny, awkward wording because that's what entertains me. So I'll write about that, or just even if I'm writing something serious, I always try to put in some little bit of humor in there just to kind of keep the reader engaged. And so I feel like there's an essay by Steve Almond, I think, called Funny is the New Deep. And it's about how important it is to have funny moments and funny writing within the darker stuff because it encapsulates how we experience a life experience. Like I think I wrote an essay about this. There was a time that Mari and I were writing at a coffee shop. We're having a terrible day. Nothing was working. It was like snowing. We're like, we hate everything. And we stand outside to smoke a cigarette and there's a hearse parked right out front. And she just looks at me and she's like, is that for one of us? And I just started like dying laughing. And I'm like, holy shit. So even in the midst of like everything wrong that can happen in a day, you got to find that little bit of humor. And so even if I'm writing the darker stuff, I try to throw in some like profanity in there to make it funny, or, you know, not necessarily attempt to bring a comic relief moment, but I allow myself that humor as a way to
Yeah, it's like you
it
have to. It's a part of the human condition. Like, here's a funny example for you. So I wrote this piece God, like probably more than 20 years ago, because I was so pissed about, not like angry at anything really, but of like trying to fit things into a form of like a story. And so I decided that I would write a story that was a run-on sentence, and the run-on
Nice.
sentence was also the main character.
Oh, cool.
Oh my God, I've submitted that thing to so many publications over the years, and it would always get denied and rejected, and people would send it back, and they were just like, please don't ever send this to anyone. I'm like, oh my God, like this is horrible, like you should quit or whatever. And so finally, like last year, a publisher, you know, picked it up, a magazine picked it up, and they published it, and I got
I
paid
love
for
it.
And they were just like, and then the first word of their response of letting me know it was going to be in the next issue was finally. And I'm like, that's all I need to hear. It's like somebody just met me on that level.
Finally, like got it. Yeah.
Absurd, like screw all the forms and formats. So
I love it. Well, I mean, like two things with that. Like that's a testament to like, don't ever give up on a piece that you love. You know, I had this one essay that I truly loved and cared about, and it got rejected for 3 years. And then finally I was just like, no, I still love this essay. And I kept submitting it, and it got accepted by a publication I really appreciated and loved. And so that got published. And then my first book, actually, Body Home, was rejected 62 times from publishers and agents. And I had just completely, I was like, okay, first book, I'm done with it. Like, that was good practice, whatever. And then I had submitted an essay that ended up being in Circadian to a contest, and it won the contest. And the manager, or the editor of it, asked if I had a manuscript because she liked my writing. And I was like, well, I have this book.
Well.
I actually do. It's been a year since I've opened this file, and I sent it to her, and she was like, perfect, love it. And it got published. So I was like, okay. So it's, I mean, that doesn't happen often. I wouldn't say that should be like your career goal there. But it's just a testament to, like, don't give up on the shit that you really love, you know? Like, I have another essay I've been working on since 2016, and it's my favorite essay I've ever written. It has been rejected, I don't even know how many times, but it's still my favorite essay, and I'm still continuing to revise it and resubmit it. And it's just, you know, you don't give up on it if you really love a piece.
Yeah, it's just like, you never know. And sometimes, like, I tell people that maybe the 5 things that you submit, maybe they're not right for the theme, but that editor or that staff, they might know somebody else, chances are, in the same industry, that maybe it'll work for their magazine or their anthology. It's just, people do talk. So
yeah. Well, and I mean, that's the thing too that I tell, because I'm a freelance editor, and I teach creative writing classes. And I tell my students and my clients all the time that it's a lot about finding the right home for a piece. You know, it could be awesome, but the journal might have just published something that was the same theme, or they published, like, they're looking for a different theme for that journal. And so it is just about finding the right home. And I think people definitely have connections.
Here's another funny rejection story. So I also do screenwriting, and I remember years ago, I was like, okay, I have the perfect thing that they're looking for, and this was just to, like, submit unsolicited into their production company, and then it was like, no theme, and, you know, we're open for everything, every genre, and follow the guidelines. I'm like, okay, I'm gonna do the research, and I found out everything, and I'm like, oh, this is perfect for them. And so the response I got back was, well, we like everything about your script except for the plot. I'm like, well, wait a minute. And that was,
how does
like,
that work?
from the producers or whatever it was. I'm like, that's it? You've had it for like 6 months or whatever? And you're like, you know what, man, just keep it. Just, you know, use it for toilet paper or whatever you guys are doing, you know, whatever you were gonna do. But to me, it was like, now that I've gotten that, it's just so much easier to hurdle that and go, like, it can't ever be worse than that. So you can just keep going on with your life and moving on. But have you gotten some crazy stuff from editors and publications before, where they're like, it's good, but it's not what we would call great or whatever?
Yeah, I've had 2 interesting rejections. One was from Ander Monson runs a journal called Diagram, and it's like one of my dream publications that I just really want to get accepted into because I love his work. And I I submitted a piece that was 84 words, and he rejected it, and his rejection was a personal rejection, and he just said, 84 words, that's gutsy. And I was like, okay. So that was my rejection for that. It actually later got published by a different journal. They were looking for flash pieces though. What was the other one? There was another one that was interesting. Oh, so I actually had somebody who requested that I write a piece of flash fiction for them. And I was like, I don't write fiction, but I can try. So I wrote this little, like, piece that was like about me being in a truck, and I say my husband because it was a nonfiction piece, because that's what I do when I write fiction. And my husband's like yelling at me, and I felt really contained, and I didn't know what to do. And so I wrote a little flash piece about that. And the guy replied, and he was like, well, it's good, but you could use some plot and some character development and some dialogue and some action. And I was like, okay, so you're rejecting the piece, and I don't write fiction. Let's move on.
One time I got a rejection from, and it was like a creative, constructive criticism, actually, after the fact, which was, this doesn't work as a poem, but maybe as a novel. I'm like, wait a minute. This is like 16 fucking lines. Like, I mean, maybe, but like, how long is your deadline?
Let me write a novel out of a poem.
You gotta wonder too if some of these places have just like a junior, like, admin staff that are, they just give them the slush pile, or like a thumb drive of stuff, and they're just like, you blow these people off, be as creative as you want.
Yeah, this is your creative time to blow them off creatively. I also one of my biggest rejections, and I guess it's considered a rejection. I when I was at my MFA program, and I submitted my master's thesis to my mentor, Skylar. She's like, "What? I'm beeping. What?" So I submitted my thesis to my mentor, and she replied with, "This is not a book. This is not even close to being a book. I don't even understand this essay. I don't know why this essay is in here. Maybe it will pass as a master's thesis, but it's not a book." I thoroughly disagreed, and I submitted the exact same manuscript to the Red Hen Press competition, and it won the competition and it got published. And so it's just one of those things where it's like somebody may absolutely, it's again with the reader and who's reading it, and somebody may absolutely hate it and think it's nothing. And you give it to a different reader and they're like, "Oh my God, I want to give you an award and publish this." So it's again, it's about finding the right home and knowing who your reader is. And because she did more like memoir and I do weird creative essays. So she hated it, but I loved it.
Yeah, and that's the same thing I tell my friends that are writers too about rejections, especially when it comes to contests, because invariably, like every year or how often they do the contest, it's a different judge or different panel.
Yeah,
That's
definitely.
year to year or person to person. That's different people, different opinions, different minds.
Yeah.
They could have been in a great mood when they woke up, and then a fire blows out on their way to the office, and they're just like, "Fuck it all."
I hate everything.
This sucks. And the first thing is just like, as she was changing the tire, and she was like, "Fuck you!" Like, and you, but
So true. Well, and it's interesting because I judge a contest. It's a quarterly contest for WoW Women on Writing. And it's interesting because some of the pieces that have won, it has been because I had been reading so many essays about like COVID-19, and they were good essays, but so many of them. And so by the time that I got to like the finalists, I was like, I'm sick of the COVID essays. And so I picked that was not a COVID essay because it was something that was like out of the, unusual for what I had been reading. And I had just gotten so frustrated with COVID essays that I was like, I'm not doing a COVID essay, but submit that, a year later or at a different time, and I won't feel the same way about COVID essays. So it will be different.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you bring that up because I kind of feel, and I've been talking to other writers on the podcast as well, is that I want to say from like March of 2020 until maybe end of last year, I was still like open and receptive to reading things relating to COVID. And then once I got into this year, it was like I could still appreciate things as quality writing and oh my God, you went through this, and like you were sitting in your pajamas eating ice cream watching Netflix like me. Interesting. Like, tell me more about your obsession with box wine and all this stuff. But then it's like, at a certain point, I think we just recede a little bit. We withdraw. We're kind of just like, I don't know. I wouldn't say like building up our walls or whatever, but it's kind of like enough. Like, it's kind of like, the only other thing I can really use as analogy is like 9/11, when there was so much stuff written about people's experience with that. And then after a year or two later, you're just like, we all agree it was horrible, but like, I just need to not, like, we all have those anthologies and we know people that put out those books and things, but it's like at a certain point, you're like, like I said, I can appreciate the good writing, but it's just like, I need to turn the page.
Yeah.
I mean, you've gotten there too.
Yeah, I've been that. I also think I think people can continue to write about COVID, but you need to be able to write about it in a different way. Like not just about drinking box wine and watching Netflix. There was one essay for the contest. I don't remember what place I gave it, but it was about how she was an elderly woman and being on lockdown, she then started like tripping over things and she was hurting herself. And she's like, we're not like concerned about these people in their houses that are like trying to fix a light bulb and they fall. And there's this like pandemic going on outside, but I'm my own sort of like danger in here. And so that was kind of funny and interesting. And so I think looking at a larger thing that we've all experienced, you got to twist it to make it like really unique to your experience and bring a different sort of meaning to it rather than just being like, this was my experience, like make something out of that.
Right. And we're always going to have that as a reference in nonfiction and fiction of those years, those, whatever you want to call it, 2020 to early 2022 or something. I remember reading an interview a while back with Stephen King where he just said he was writing, it was like a story or a novel or something, and it took place on a cruise ship, and he was just like trying to put in like, references, and then he went,
Mhm.
I I can't have this story take place now. Like it has to be 2019
Yeah, it has to be.
because
Yeah.
no one's just going to be like carefree and
Yeah.
in the pool and playing volleyball and whatever people do on cruises and walking around with their martinis and things, because I mean people are, it's opening
Yeah.
up, but it's still not quite like it was in 2019. So
Yeah. No, and I have a client who's working on a collection of short stories about American travelers, and she started writing it, I think, in 2018 or 2019. And it's this really awesome book about what it is to be an American traveling overseas, and there's like funny cross stories and whatnot. But as she's worked on it, COVID happens, and so it's like, how does that book read now compared to what it would have read like 2 years ago? So she's having to deal with that.
it's just life. We got to figure it out.
Yeah.
So tell me, even though you've had quite a bit published and you have your books and pieces of paper and things when you go to readings and open mics and things, are there still pieces that are either too fresh or too personal that you don't read at readings?
It's interesting. I had one essay, mostly it's essays that like I have to be able to practice reading them and not cry by the time I get to the end of them, because I write really personal shit. And one of them was an essay about this woman that I mentored, and she ended up relapsing. She was an alcoholic and she relapsed, and she was going to jump off a building, and last minute she decided not to, and she turned around and climbed to get back up, and she slipped and she fell to her death. And so trying to write that essay, I was sobbing the entire time I wrote it. And then every time that I tried reading it at a reading, I have to like dissociate in order to do that, because it's a kick-ass essay. But it's really like, there are a couple essays that I have to sit with them for a while and be okay with them and move on in order to read it at a reading. And that was definitely one of them that was hard.
Okay, and then let me flip that and say, because I have this issue myself at readings or open mics, if I try to go back and read something that's 15, 20 years old and then try to reconnect with that feeling or that person that I was.
Yeah.
And it's so hard because we all are in different places in our life. We have
Mhm.
different jobs, we live in different cities, different, everything.
Yeah.
And so there's times when I remember, reading old stuff, and well, first of all, I go back and I go like, oh, is that really a good fucking word choice? Good job, asshole. And then
Exactly.
like, really? Like, what were you thinking in 2004?
What were you thinking about that?
What a dumbass. And then so like, it's such an obvious word. And then but then you get up and you're reading it, and it almost feels like you're reading someone else's work.
Yeah. No, and it's interesting because it's funny. Like I've noticed more about the content, and I mean the writing's definitely different because I've grown as a writer, but what I have chosen to write about is vastly different. Like my first book was all about sex and sexuality. And in fact, my very first essay I ever had published was this weird, funny essay about masturbation. And I was able to like email it to my mom and be like, I got my first publication. Sorry about the content. And she was like, no, she was like, this is the best piece of erotica I've ever read. And I'm like, thank you, Mom. Okay, I doubt you've read that much erotica, and it's not erotica, but thank you. And so I look at my first book, Body Home, and there's that essay in it. And there's just so many essays about sex and sexuality, because I was trying to be like shocking and write about shit that people don't write about that much. Although I guess you could say that they do. But anyways, I was trying to be more shocking. And so whenever I do readings, I don't ever go back to Body Home to read something from it, because that's not what I look at now, and that's not who I am as a writer. And I don't think I would write another essay about masturbation ever again. But the essay's out there. But
exactly.
It's just not.
It's like if you're going to go to a reading and it's one of those books that you've got propped up on the table, so people are going to be like, well, what about that? Will she read that?
You're like, okay, you're gonna read this now. And sometimes I'm like, oh, I can't believe I put that out in the world.
Well, yeah, it's got to be like a singer or a songwriter, right? It's like people want you to quote unquote play the hits.
Yeah, exactly.
And you're like,
I really
I got
don't
the
want to
new
read this
thing.
one.
I want to promote the new thing. I've got like 4 or 5 winners from the new thing, and they're like,
no, I want to hear that one song. Yeah, no, it definitely. I don't think I would ever bring up any more essays in that one because I've moved beyond it. But there were like the standards from it that I would read at readings, and it's just not who I am as a writer anymore. And so I have moved beyond those.
Okay, so I'm going to make the big turn here to the next topic, and I have to show you because I wrote it down here, and it's like I didn't know how to phrase it as a question, so I literally just wrote, so
Knitting. Knitting. What's okay? We love knitting. Yeah, I realized I figured by the name of the podcast you probably wanted to talk about knitting as well. Yes, I am a knitter, and I have been knitting since 2018. And the day that I learned how to knit. Here, this is a good story. I learned how to knit when I was 17 by this woman named Emma, and she was like my mentor person. And then we had a falling out, and she gave me a silent treatment for 15 years, and I didn't talk to her. It broke my heart. I like attempted suicide because of it. I mean, it was a hot mess. So 15 years later, Facebook happens, and we end up reconnecting. And in 2017, we became friends again. And in 2018, she taught me how to knit again. And this time it just like stuck. And I just really loved knitting. And then in April of 2018, she stopped talking to me again. We had another falling out. And I was so incredibly depressed again because this was like my mentor person. And so I started just knitting, and knitting became my therapy. And like, if I was feeling depressed, if I was feeling like I wanted to self-harm or suicidal, I just sat there and I just knitted, and that's all I did. And I ended up making like 75 hats in that first year. And I just like have been knitting constantly since then. And it's kind of like my therapy throughout the day, I guess you could say. I don't have a therapist anymore, but knitting like helps to calm me down and center me. And I've noticed that I write less because I knit more. I usually knit between like 2 to 8 hours a day. That's how much time I spend knitting. But I know it's like, wow, I don't have anything else to do with my life. But that's how much I used to write. But now as I knit, I'm like writing in my head. And so when I go to write, my first drafts are really like the 18th drafts.
Right. You're pruning in your head already. So
yeah. And so while like usually here, I'll show you. Usually these like little one subject notebooks, when like in 2014, I filled up 14 of them, I think, in 1 year. This one I've had for a year and I'm not done with it yet. And so my writing has definitely, like the amount of writing has decreased because of knitting, but the knitting has helped those drafts be better when they actually do come onto the page. So yeah, I knit, and I actually started designing my own knitting wear too. Like the tank top I'm wearing was my own design. And
wow,
nice. I knit so much that if I'm wearing it, I knitted it, except for like pants or whatever. But
it's like, how much free advertising can you get? Like right. Everywhere you go in your day, people are like, where did you get that?
Funny that is so happened. I know. I like, no, it happens every time I go in the world. Someone's like, I really like your shirt. I'm like, I made it. And they're like, oh my God. And especially when I go to like Joann's or Hobby Lobby and like, where I'm there to get yarn. And this happened the other day. This one was like, I really like your shirt. I'm like, thanks. I actually designed it and made it. And she's like, do you have a card? Because I want you to make this.
And you're like, person. Do I?
No, exactly. It's like on my phone, I have my little like business cards. My sister told me I had to carry them around with me. I was like, okay. They're actually my writing and editing business cards, but like my email address is on there. And I'm like, here you go. So
that's awesome. And so it's interesting that you brought up that with the notebook talking about writing less, because I noticed, and maybe with hobbies and things like knitting, and we all have our own hobbies, but that because of, or maybe going through the lockdown and the pandemic, I personally, for a long time, like I got so much writing done like right away because I was like, free time, yes, here we go. But then over like the period of like months, and I'm like, oh well, I've finished that thing I never thought I was gonna have time to do. I'm like, I finished that other thing I never thought I was gonna have time to do. And then it got to the point where I was writing like less and less and less, and then I kind of took a break from it. And then I realized, especially like last year, that I was writing less, but the pieces themselves were like more profound. But I had a realization, and I think a lot of people did too, that we weren't having those life experiences that feed everything. So it's like you weren't out as much like overhearing a funny conversation and something might have struck you as a really cool title or a funny line you could use. And I always like to say that somewhere between if you have two people sitting on either side of you in a supermarket line, invariably someone will say something really profound and somebody else will say something completely idiotic. And like in the middle somewhere is poetry or some kind of writing thing where you're like, ding.
Yep. Yeah, and it's interesting because like when I was living in Colorado by myself out in the middle of nowhere, I wasn't having human interaction. I mean, it was like through Facebook and texting and whatnot, but it is a big difference when you're just so isolated to be able to come up with that sort of material. Like it's a good, I always considered it like a good break for me to write all the things I wanted to write. Like when people first went into lockdown, I was teaching a class that semester and it completely filled up and I had like 20 students when usually I have like 10 because nobody else had anything to do. They were like, I'll
They're
take a
like
writing class.
anything.
And I got all these like a month or two into lockdown, I got all these memoirs. Like my work was just like booming. So I'm like, okay, now I'm editing all these books because people had time. And so I think like lockdowns or being out in the middle of nowhere can help get that material just out of you, but that you do need those interactions in order to fuel what it is that you're eventually going to start writing about.
Yeah, I think a lot of people were of the same state of mind that I was, which was like, great, I have all the free time. I'm going to get all that stuff done that I want to do. And then it's like, oh, well, you accomplished everything you wanted to do in that first 6 months. And then you're like, well, now what?
Yeah, now what do I do?
Now I've got to live and I've got to do things and I can't watch 8,000 documentaries
Right?
on
I've
streaming. I've got
watched
to like
all
get
of
out in the
Netflix.
world and like, because it's
Yeah.
like we don't realize how much we need like human interaction. Like
Yeah. No, and it's
even just
important.
me like looking into the camera and like seeing you and like all the stuff like behind you and stuff
Yeah.
like it's a whole other world. It's like your life. It's like three-dimensional. It's like
Yeah.
rather than just being like texting somebody where in the middle of the text you're doing this and all of a sudden there's no text for like 7 minutes and you're like, did they
It's
die?
that. Yeah.
Did someone get hit by a car? Or, like
Like
random
what
dog
the
came in? Like did somebody just like, ooh, shiny or something and get
Yeah.
distracted,
No, for sure.
So
Yeah, definitely.
I
When
mean,
I was living in Colorado, I was actually long distance dating somebody who was in Chicago and
that's
we were
hard.
together. Yeah, try dating somebody during a lockdown and a long distance relationship. It sucks. And so it was all texting. The entire relationship was texting. And then even when I lived out in the middle of nowhere, I lived so out in the middle of nowhere that I didn't receive text messages. So then it was based on Facebook messaging, which I honestly is even more annoying.
Oh my
And
God.
or it's really annoying because you can be like, he saw that message. How come he hasn't replied? What's going on? And you just like
Oh,
get
that's
in
the
your head.
worst because you have
Yes.
the read
You're
function
like,
and
they
you're like,
read it. You're
what are
like,
they doing? And
"Ugh."
they're like, they get back to you like 2 hours later, like, I was driving.
Driving. You're like,
And
no,
you're
I
like,
have to be.
were you though? Were you really?
Exactly. You get in your head a lot. And so those like human interactions where you actually face to face, even fake face to face like this, are really important. And they fuel everything that we do and they help to get us out of our heads. And so while I think writing is such this like solitary in your head sort of thing, and even too like with knitting, it's the same thing where like you're making something and like you want to show it to people when you're done because you're just like,
You're
I
like,
did this
huh?
thing, like it's
No.
really like I made like 2 wardrobes when I lived out in the middle of nowhere, but I was like living out in the middle of nowhere, so nobody saw what I was wearing. And so I'd constantly be texting pictures of my boyfriend to be like, look, I look cute today in the shirt that I made. Nobody else, my dog's gonna see it. Nobody else is going to be able to appreciate this. So I think it's important to have that human interaction, whether that's to like
But
share your
what's
writing or
interesting is
what.
you in mentally you have those thoughts, but then like the pictures of you like on your website and like online of like the knitting and everything, it's like
Mhm.
you just seem so serene and like grounded and like freaking happy and like no rush, no worry, no stress, just doing my thing. And even the people around you, like it's so funny, they could just be like nervously like smoking like around you or drinking, and you're just like,
Doing my thing.
but that's great because it's so rare because especially with everything going on in the world right now, it's like to find that thing that centers you.
Yeah, and definitely like writing used to be more the thing that centered me. It was more of my therapeutic sort of passion. And now I feel like knitting centers me because I'll take my knitting out in public and while I'm like waiting for something, like at the airport, it's the funniest thing. I'll have a little bag that I can like carry on my wrist and I'm just sitting there in line and people are like, oh my God, this is taking too long. I'm like, whatever, I get a knit. So I'm just like, I'm fine waiting in the airport.
You're
I'll
like,
knit in the
time is a
traffic.
river, whatever.
Yeah, whatever. I get to knit more. This red light's taken forever. I'm fine with that. I can just knit. So it definitely helps to calm me. And well, it's really funny because I'm constantly busy and I'm always doing something. And knitting is part of that. It helps me to keep my hands busy because I'm the kind of person that has a really hard time just sitting still and doing nothing. I'm terrible at meditation because I'm like, there's so many other things I could be doing. And being a freelance editor for so long, there's no work schedule. And so you feel like you have to create your work and you should always be working. And so I started freelancing in 2014. And from then, I now work a more regular sort of editor job, but I still freelance. And so it's just taught me that you always have to be doing something. And so the knitting has helped to like fill that time. So while I feel somewhat chaotic in my schedule or in my life, I have the knitting that centers me.
Well, let me ask you this and dovetail from that into, because this is an issue that I had like during lockdown when before the business I was working for completely shut down, which was I just personally do not like the idea of doing like it was an office job, but to do what I call work, like paid office work that is not like creative work, which is like pay the bills
Mhm.
job
Yeah,
after like 5 o'clock. Like I want to like be done. I
you
want
be
to
done.
not think about it or
Yeah,
compartmentalize it or whatever. And then I want to like, either focus on my daughter or making dinner or
yeah,
everything else I've got to do. And then it's like that went away in
yeah,
2020 and it really freaked me the hell out where it was like
yeah.
the employers were just suddenly like, well, you're at home and we can see your computer's on, so why don't you work until like 11 o'clock? And it's like,
Right. And you're like,
I
no.
no. And then it's like the more you say no, the more pissed off they would get. And I think
Yeah,
that there's just been this shift in the last like 2 years of people being like, we have to live.
yeah. Well,
Like,
and
did you run
it's
into
the
that in
work.
the last 2 years?
Well, no, it's interesting. Like I'm terrible at work-life balance. Again, from the freelance editing, I just work all the time. But the job that I work, it's for a company called Paper Check, and I just do proofreading online. And we actually have shifts, and mine is from 3 p.m. to 11 p.m. And so that actually gives me the entire day to do my own writing, to do my freelance
Yeah,
work, to do
yeah.
my
That's
knitting.
pretty spread out.
Yeah. And so then 3 to 11, and you start getting tired around 10, and you get your pajamas on and you finish up what you're doing. But when we actually had an influx of work during COVID because everything went online and we're the online, editing company. And so we had all this work come in, and you'll get texts to be like, okay, we have a lot of work. Do you want to come in? And there was a week actually when I moved here from Colorado. I took PTO for a week and I ended up working every single one of those days, except for the day that I was driving from Colorado to Texas because we had so much work. And so I personally don't know how to say no to people. And it's something that I'm working on. I'm really bad at setting boundaries when it comes to that. So I think like for people who work those sorts of jobs from home and you have to figure out your schedule, it's hard to be like, no, I'm done working at 5. And yes, I might be in front of my computer and I might be able to scoot over and like send an email really quickly, but I'm done working at 5. And I don't think I would be able to do it. So I'm totally like hoping other people can.
I
But
think
that's what you got to do.
well, and I think it comes a point, especially with people that are parents, where it's like you have to be able to change your focus because it's
Mhm.
like you can't be the same person I think you are when you're like regimented and like at a quote unquote like office job
Yeah.
that you are with your kid, because with your kid, like for me it's like I've got to be dad now. I've got to like
Yeah.
I
You have to
have a
switch
young child.
gears.
I gotta like focus. I can't like be running back to a laptop because one of the issues I had was this my personal cell phone becoming like a work phone, which to me was
Oh,
like not
yeah.
okay. But they were like, well, now you're working from home and it's lockdown, so we'll call you. And like, how come we didn't answer these 4 calls? I'm like, dude, it was like 4 in the morning.
Oh my God.
And they're like, yeah, but India and China time. I'm like, I don't work in
Yeah.
India and
India
China.
or China. Like that's
What?
not the same.
So yeah, there was like a whole thing. So it seems like you're like a little bit more free with like how
Yeah.
your work is kind of spread out and stuff like that.
Well, and it's interesting too, because I don't have kids. When I was helping out, when I lived in Waco with my friend Emma for a year, I was helping co-parent her 3 kids that were all under the age of 9. And that was my first little experience of like, oh, this is what it is to be a parent. And like, it really does take 2 hours to put a child to sleep sometimes. Like, I finally understood that and saw like how important it is to be able to shut off like work time because you have kid time. And now at the house that I'm living in, the kids are older. They're like 20, 17, and 13. So they're not like
They're more
young little.
self-sufficient. Yeah.
Yeah, one of them goes to work, the other two goes to school or goes to work. But it still is like at night when my sister gets home from work, like she is not at work anymore. She stops working and she's the parent. And her partner works from home and she is the same way. Like she has to stop working at a certain time and
Yeah, you
then
have to
she's the parent.
decompress.
Yeah.
You have to like be able to just. It's one of those things. I've had this conversation with so many people where it's like, well, what are we working for? It's like
Yeah.
at a certain point, like the work has to stop and you have to live because we want to
Yeah.
live, right? We want to
Yeah.
be alive and enjoy being alive.
Yeah. Well, that's what's
So,
interesting having my work be as an editor, because I'm a writer and editor of my own work. And so I constantly feel like I am always working. And even if I'm editing for somebody else, I'm like taking cues from their writing and thinking about my own writing. And
right.
so like it's interesting. And I mean, so I wake up at like 8, I try to go running and then I knit and then I'm editing all day and I'm editing all through my shift. And it's interesting because I love editing and I love writing, so that's helpful. And so I feel like my passion is able to come through every day. If I had a job that I did not enjoy doing, it would be a very hard life to be able to work that much. In fact, one of my coworkers at this job, she's new, and she was like, "So how do you edit all day?" And I'm like, "I really enjoy it. And if I didn't enjoy it, my life would be terrible if I didn't enjoy it."
Yeah, I think that's just the thing that a lot of people in the world went through in the last 2 years is that it was so much easier to compartmentalize in your brain, like something you didn't like doing for money to pay bills or whatever, to go to a place.
Yeah.
And then it's
you
like
can have that
at
separation.
a certain time, it's like you're done. The
Yeah.
evilness that you have to endure, like it stays there behind, a cross or magic spell,
Yeah.
and then you can leave and like
Go do your
decompress.
thing.
But then it's like when you're at home and it's there and it's present and it's like living with you the whole time, you're
Yeah.
like it's like this weird icky feeling of like never being free.
Yeah. And when people started working from home, I was like, welcome to being a freelance person where you're always working, because that's just what it is. And so, again, like I'm lucky that my freelance work is something that I love doing. But yeah, that's what work from home is, unfortunately.
All right, well, we've been chatting for a bit here, so let me ask you a few things to wrap up here. So are there other kind of creative outlets that you'd like to like engage in, like painting or drawing or music or?
Oh, I'm terrible at painting and I'm terrible at drawing. I used to play the piano and a little bit of guitar, but actually, one of my friends is a singer-songwriter and she has a show every Thursday. And so I go to live music every Thursday. And that is like, it's so nice to have your favorite singer be a local musician. And she actually, her name's Patrice Pike. She was my favorite singer when I was 15. And I followed her music all through these decades. I'm 39 now. And so it's fun to have a sort of like community that you go out to and be surrounded by such like it's a 7-piece band, I think, maybe sometimes 6-piece that plays. And so to see that sort of energy on stage definitely feels like an act of creativity that I get to witness. So that's
yeah, and to have an outlet where someone isn't trying to like get something from you.
Yeah, exactly. I
Not
can
a
just sit here and
deadline,
enjoy.
it's not like something hanging over you where you're just like wear my comfortable clothes and go out and be with my friends,
Exactly. And that's that decompressing time. And so every single week, every Thursday, it's what I look forward to. That's my time when I'm like, nothing can barge in on this. This
like
is what I do.
phone is on silent.
Yes.
Everybody fuck off. Just let me.
Exactly. Yeah. Fuck off. I'm at a Patrice Pike show. Everyone just go away.
Okay, so let me ask you. So I know that you've got this book coming out from Red Hen, but that I think has probably been in development for a while. So what is next? Are you gonna take like a big long vacation or a road trip, or are you gonna put something out like in a year or two, or what's the plan?
The plan, in 2019, I was the Jack Kerouac writer in residence at the
Saw that
Kerouac
video.
House. Yeah, awesome. It was awesome. I wrote for 3 months. That's what I did for 3 months. No work, no nothing, just 3 months. And I wrote half a book when I was there. And that was in 2019. And since that time, I've written like a third more of it. So I'm working, it's the one about the resilient women in my life. So I'm working on that collection of essays that I think once this book comes out, I'm going to start pitching that one. If I have like 3 more essays I want to write. And then I'm also in the works, I want to write a collection of essays that is about how knitting has changed my life and integrate it with different knitting patterns that I've created. So that I've written one essay for. So that will be much later, but it's something that I just really want. And I don't know if there's anything like that out in the world. So
I don't think so. I think that might be something kind of new and refreshing. So
yeah, so that's like my fun project that I'll work on at some point.
rock on. Okay, so to wrap things up here, why don't you go ahead and kind of unspool your list of all of your like social media where people can find you and where they can maybe see or read some of your work.
Yeah, well, you can go to my website, www.chelseiclammer.com. It's Chelsey with a Y because my mom wanted me to have an odd spelling. So thank you, Mother. So chelseiclammer.com. And that has my long list of publications. And I say long, and you can look at it. And it's like everything I've ever written, I've gotten published by random places. Ever since like 2014, I was just like, here, publish
There it
these.
all is.
Yeah, so that has all my publications and links to everything. And then you can also follow me on Facebook and come and bug me. That's how I know a lot of people. And then I also do Instagram. I think I'm at CJ Clammer, and that's mostly where I put all my knitting stuff on there. And then I have Twitter, and I never check it.
I haven't used Twitter in so long.
I don't know. Every once in a while, I'm like, oh, the app, right? It's on my phone. Oh, somebody like mentioned me. Okay, I have no idea.
You're like,
So,
oh, yeah, I should probably, and then like the phone rings, and you're like, eh.
No, okay. And then the Human Heartbeat Detected is coming out end of August, and I'm gonna be doing a book tour for it, and I'll be going to like Austin and probably New York, definitely the LA area, and Denver, and maybe Seattle and Houston.
Nice.
And maybe Florida. Yeah.
Well, you are just like a rocket that keeps going up and up and up, and so major props to you. So
Thanks.
Congratulations for everything.
Well,
And thanks for being on the show. And
yeah, thanks for having me again.
No problem. And enjoy the rest of your week.
Thanks. You too.
Bye.
Bye.